first and foremost, when you talked about splitting them into one versus two teams, when you split the teams, your staff allotment or your skill placement for each of the teams should not really be driven by an abstract number of what somebody said in a book, for example, right? What you got to understand is why would say the Scrum Guide, for example, why would it say that you want the developers to be no more than 9 people? Well, the idea is that the smaller the team, the more self-contained the skills, and the easier it is for you to chunk things into smaller pieces and deliver them holistically at the end of every time box. But if your scope of work does not lend itself well to just 9 people, and you feel like 20 people is the right one, right? Maybe in your situation, there isn't as much dependencies across those individual 20 people, and maybe they can all work on multiple things at the same time in parallel. And then they all sort of converge at one point together where you integrate and things like that. So if that's the case and there isn't as much uncertainty, then you don't have to break the team down to 5 people or 6 people or 9 people, right? So again, breaking down the team should be based on how the system is laid out, right? How the skills are going to interact with each other, and then the amount of uncertainty you have in terms of how you're just dealing with scope, right? Then you make a decision of whether you want to use, Scrum or Kanban or extreme programming, one of those things. But be that as it may, the larger point you had of, we're still not tracking it by two teams. We still have one bucket of work. So we have one retrospective or we have one velocity tracking and things like that. So in Jira, which is a very popular tool that a lot of companies use, or whether you use version one, Rally, whatever tool you're using, at the end of the day, it's a backlog management tool, right? It's no different than an Excel sheet. You can just put a bunch of work items, line them up in a certain prioritized order. You can create views on top of that to see at any given point in time how you're finishing work. If you're working them as two different teams, then my first question would be to think about whether each of those teams and their work is self-contained, which means they can actually finish things without being heavily dependent on the other person. If each team is not complete by themselves, then it warrants a deeper conversation on how you're setting up the skills. Because what the last thing you want is one team finishes their work, but they're truly not done until the next team finishes their work, right? So and then what happens is you have a relay race, and the relay race only finishes when the last team finishes their work. So you don't want that. The way you're stacking up your skills and the way you're setting up your work in each of these teams should be lending itself to a self-contained batch size. There's an easy, clear-cut answer that in Jira, in your tool, track them as two separate teams, track them as two separate backlogs, have two separate Scrum Masters, two separate product owners who can prioritize the work and facilitate all those meetings for them, and then just track them as two different cadences. And if you're the manager across both these teams, then you can decide which team meeting you want to go into, because there might be some kind of complementing nature to things, like maybe both of them are planning on a Tuesday, both of them finish on a Wednesday or something like that. But the teams by themselves should operate on an independent cadence if there's no dependency in the work. And you could just create a view, like you can tag the work items team one versus team two just to filter them out. There's a risk that all of your data across the two teams is sitting in one big laundry list of the backlog. And so as long as the product owners are being very diligent about tagging those work items to their teams and their whatever work classification is, it makes it easier. Because if anybody misses that discipline, then you have an orphan work item that is sitting in that big laundry list. And then over a period of time, it becomes very difficult to figure out, which team this started with. Set standards. So set standards for how you tag your work. Set standards for how you classify parent-child relationships, which means every project needs to have an epic. Every epic needs to have a story. Every story needs to have a team. Every epic needs to have a team. So what you can do is you can publish those global standards that will scale across multiple teams, across multiple portfolios. And eventually the same standards can be used by any team in the portfolio. And that way, whenever somebody puts in a work item, there are certain mandatory fields they have to fill in. And if they do that, then any report you create across teams will pull out hygienic data. And so this is all about, standards that you're setting for scaling over not just one team, but across the entire portfolio. This is basic Jira management 101, if you will. So if you have a Jira admin on the team, then you want to invite them and you want to work with them to set those standards for which fields need to be populated, when they need to be populated, what they need to be tagged to, and things like that. This has less to do with the agile delivery model and more to do with work management in general.